Jaime Lannister stood on the ramparts of the Red Keep the night after Lord Eddard Stark's head rolled beneath the executioner's blade. The wind off Blackwater Bay carried a hint of salt that stung his nostrils. Torches still flickered below in the courtyard where the crowds had gathered, where they had gasped and cried at the sight of the once honorable Stark kneeling at the mercy of a boy king. Now only silent guards remained, along with a few scuttling attendants. It was as though the great fortress herself exhaled a hushed tension in the aftermath. Jaime's golden hair caught the torchlight as it moved in the breeze, but his face remained unreadable. Inside his mind, a tempest brewed. The clangor that had overtaken King's Landing earlier in the day, the roars of approval and screams of dismay, still reverberated in his ears. Yet the city had settled into a kind of hushed dread, as if fearful of the next command that might come from the Iron Throne. The taste of iron hung on Jaime's tongue, and it made him feel ill. He closed his eyes and saw Eddard Stark kneeling. No, not kneeling, but forced down, shoulders stiff with the final dregs of dignity. His jaw set. He had always found Ned Stark grim and humorless, but never lacking in courage. Jaime was no friend to the man, nor was he an enemy in the true sense. They had faced one another outside the Red Keep in times past, their silent mutual disdain bridged by an unspoken understanding of honor, though each man viewed the other's sense of honor as flawed. He did not know what he found so unsettling about that day's event, only that he had thought King Joffrey's new rule would be merely a shift of power that continued to favor House Lannister. Tywin Lannister's gold financed the crown, after all, and Cersei Lannister commanded the boy's ear. But there was an ugliness in seeing Eddard Stark die that Jaime had not anticipated. Even the act of slaying the Mad King, Aerys Targaryen, had carried a sense of necessity. It had been Jaime's personal brand of heroism, even if the rest of the realm saw it as treachery. But to watch Ned Stark, no friend to him, yet clearly an honorable man, executed for the sake of a Lannister victory felt different. It was like stepping across a threshold beyond which there was no turning back. He took a long, slow breath and raked his fingers through his hair. Far below, in the yard, a pair of guards were speaking, voices too faint to be heard. The golden lion crest on Jaime's crimson cloak shimmered. He wondered what those guards thought of him. Did they see him as the Kingslayer, ever plotting some new betrayal, or simply as the golden son of House Lannister, enjoying the spoils of his father's cunning? Until this moment, he had never truly cared. He had accepted the scorn of those who cursed him for slaying Aerys in cold blood, just as he had accepted the praise from those who admired his skill and boldness. Now something in him quivered with disquiet. And as he stood there, with King's Landing sprawling out in torchlit gloom, he felt a tear in the tapestry of his loyalties. Jaime had always worn his arrogance like a shield, deflecting any doubts or regrets. He had told himself that he was a Lannister, that the gods had placed him above all others, that his twin sister was the most desirable woman in Westeros and his father the most powerful lord in the Seven Kingdoms. What more could a man ask for? But that question lingered now, heavy with a weight he couldn't ignore. Honor, dignity, a sense that you had not sacrificed your soul for the sake of ambition. Jaime had scoffed at such scruples once, but they refused to be dismissed any longer. He leaned forward, looking down at the courtyard where a pool of congealing blood had marked the end of Ned Stark. That man's children were scattered. 2 daughters rumored to be in King's Landing still, 3 other children in the north, a bastard in the Night's Watch, and Jaime felt a sense of pity for them. He pictured Catelyn Stark's face, the way it hardened whenever she heard his name. She had once called him an oathbreaker. If she ever laid eyes on him now, that hatred would no doubt burn brighter. She would likely try to kill him herself if she could. And yet, in that moment, Jaime felt almost as though he deserved it. Long minutes passed before he finally turned away from the battlements. He descended the dark steps that led into the bowels of the Red Keep, boots echoing on stone. A pair of torches lit the corridor in jittery orange. He thought of Cersei, who had shown little remorse over Ned Stark's death. He thought of Joffrey, who seemed to relish the chance to display his power, to prove himself a fearsome king rather than a child. That notion unsettled Jaime most of all, for he had no illusions about how Joffrey had come into this world. He walked through corridors lined with red carpets and gold banners, each step taking him closer to the royal apartments. Servants bowed and curtsied as he passed, murmuring "My lord" or "Sir Jaime." He acknowledged none of them, lost in his swirling thoughts. Finally, he reached the door to his sister's chambers. 2 Kingsguards stood sentinel, each man's gaze unwavering. Jaime did not speak a word as he pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled of perfumed oils. Cersei was there, robed in gold silk, gazing into a mirror as she removed her jewelry. Her hair spilled over her shoulders, and in the candlelight she looked every bit the queen she was. She turned upon hearing him enter, a brief smile curling her lips, but that smile died when she saw the expression on his face. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice hushed as if the walls had ears. They always did. Jaime closed the door. He was careful to keep his voice low, though his anger simmered beneath the surface. "You know very well what's happened," he said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the courtyard, even though it was many levels below. "He was a prisoner. We could have traded him for Sansa or Arya, or used him as a bargaining chip with Robb Stark. Now he's dead, and we're left with the consequences of King Joffrey's ambition." Cersei's mouth twitched. She ran a hand along her neck, her green eyes calculating. "Joffrey acted against my counsel, Jaime. I did not advise him to kill Ned Stark. He did it on his own, to show he's no boy to be trifled with. Perhaps it will instill fear in the rest of our enemies." He studied her face. He knew Cersei, knew her cunning, her capacity for manipulation, and also the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. "You could have stopped him if you truly wanted to," Jaime said, his voice growing colder. "You know how to handle him, flattery, mild threats, appeals to his pride. But you stood there. You let it happen." She turned away and went to a small table where a decanter of wine awaited. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured herself a cup. "Don't you dare make this my fault. Everything is precarious. Father is at Harrenhal trying to win this war. Stannis Baratheon has declared he's the rightful heir. Renly has crowned himself. Robb Stark is mustering in the north. We are beset by enemies. If we do not act swiftly, we could lose everything. Is that what Father has taught us?" Jaime asked, stepping closer. "That no price is too high for the power of House Lannister? Even if it means murdering captives in cold blood?" Her gaze flicked to him sharply. "We did not swing the sword, Jaime." He laughed bitterly. "For once, that's true. Usually it's my blade doing the dirty work. But this time the boy, our boy, did it." He lowered his voice to a hiss. "Tell me, sister, does that not trouble you? He's cruel. He's vain. He's impulsive. And he does not care a whit for the consequences. It's not a good look for a king, is it?" Cersei's jaw clenched. She sipped her wine, then placed the cup down. "We'll manage him, like we manage everything else." Jaime studied her carefully. He took in the arch of her brows, the slight tension around her mouth. "You think you can manage him," he said quietly. "And if he cannot be controlled, what then?" She said nothing, merely looked down at her hands. He sensed her uncertainty, but she would never admit it openly. Pride was a Lannister virtue, after all. After a long moment, she moved closer, placed a hand on his chest. "I need you, Jaime. Our family needs you. You're the one person I can trust in all of this chaos." He felt his resolve waver. He had always wanted to protect her, to stand by her side no matter what. But now, it felt as though they were perched on the edge of a precipice, and every step forward threatened to hurl them into darkness. He remembered the last time he had truly questioned his place, the day he stood before the Iron Throne with Aerys Targaryen's blood dripping from his sword. Then, he had believed he was doing the right thing, saving thousands of lives from wildfire. Now, there was no sense of righteousness in the acts House Lannister committed, only raw ambition and cruelty. He gently took her hand from his chest. "We should have used Ned Stark to end this war more quickly," he said. "Now we face a more terrible onslaught. The North will rage. Robb Stark will never forgive us. And Father will demand that we press our advantage. More death, More blood. Her eyes narrowed. We are Lannisters. We do not balk at war. If the Starks want vengeance, let them come. Our armies will crush them. Jaime said nothing more, for what could he say? He left her chambers with a heavy heart, not even acknowledging the guards as he passed. He roamed the halls, trying to find relief from the churn of his thoughts, but it proved elusive. It was like a shadow dogged his every step. He passed a balcony overlooking the throne room. Down below, the great seat of power cast its ominous shadow in the flickering torchlight. He remembered sitting in that very seat after slaying Ares, waiting for the realm to judge him. They had given him a mocking name, Kingslayer, for the rest of his life. But he had never regretted killing the Mad King. It needed to be done. For once, he had been the hero, though no one recognized it. This, however, was different. Joffrey was no Mad King yet, but the seeds of cruelty had clearly taken root in him. Would Jaime once more have to raise a sword to protect the realm from a mad ruler? And if it came to that, could he do it to his own blood? He spent the rest of the night wandering until dawn's pale light kissed the sky. Servants were rising, going about their business. The city shook off its uneasy sleep. Jaime found himself in his own chambers, mind a-whirl. He removed his armor piece by piece until he stood in his tunic and breeches. He stared at the lion-embossed breastplate for a time, his fingertips grazing the proud sigil. Memories flooded him. His father's stern expectations, Cersei's whispered coaxing, Tyrion's sarcastic banter, and the sense of belonging he had once felt in the gilded halls of Casterly Rock. Now, as the sun rose on a city haunted by the shadow of Ned Stark's beheading, Jaime's heart pounded with a new realization. He felt the precariousness of everything he had known. House Lannister was built on wealth and power, but also on fear and manipulation. He had always told himself that, as the eldest son, his place was with his father, that House Lannister was his birthright. But was that enough? Should that absolve him of all moral choice? He stood at the window, gazing over the rising city. Smoke curled from countless chimneys, and he could hear the distant cries of laborers and traders opening for business. Life went on, but it was tainted by the knowledge that the crown had just shattered any illusion of mercy or justice. How would the city's small folk respond? Fear, always fear. That was the Lannister coin, minted in gold and terror. By midday, he had made a decision, though he could scarcely believe it himself. He felt his heart pound, his palms damp with sweat. Perhaps it was madness. Perhaps it was the first truly honorable impulse he had felt in years. He strapped on his sword belt over a plain tunic, leaving his Lannister cloak behind. Then he left his chambers, ignoring the looks from servants and guards who seemed puzzled to see him not wearing his armor or cloak. He moved briskly through the Red Keep, his footsteps guided by some inner compass that felt more certain than any Lannister motto or cunning. Passing a pair of gold cloaks, he made his way to the stables, where the smell of hay and horse sweat greeted him. Grooms scurried to help him, but he waved them off, selecting a chestnut mare known for speed and endurance. Jaime saddled her himself, the motions of buckling straps so familiar that they almost steadied his trembling spirit. He led the mare out into the courtyard, mounted, and glanced back at the Red Keep. The scarlet banners bearing golden lions fluttered in the breeze. He wondered if this was the last time he would look upon them as Jaime Lannister, son of Tywin Lannister, twin brother of Cersei Lannister. A part of him felt an inexplicable sorrow, as though he were leaving a piece of himself behind. Then he spurred the horse and rode out through the gates. The guards recognized him, saluted, and let him pass without question. He was Jaime Lannister, after all. He had the freedom to come and go as he pleased. No one suspected he might be doing anything more than riding out on some trivial errand. King's Landing bustled with activity, but he picked his way through the crowds, ignoring the occasional wave or sneer. Some recognized the famous knight with the golden hair and whispered his name. Others just saw another lordling on a fine mount. Jaime rode until he reached the city's gate, where a handful of gold cloaks stood vigil. Again, none hindered him. They simply nodded and let him through. It was both startling and reassuring how easily a man with reputation and status could slip away. Once outside the city walls, he urged the chestnut mare into a swift gallop, putting distance between himself and the seat of his family's power. There was no exact plan in his mind, only an urgent need to be away from the stifling corruption of King's Landing. He felt as though he could not breathe there any longer, with the ghost of Ned Stark's last moments hanging in the air and Joffrey's twisted grin commanding all. He rode through the countryside that stretched out from the capital, passing farmland and small villages. He felt a sense of liberation, though mingled with dread, for he had done something unthinkable. He had simply left. Renunciation hovered at the edge of his consciousness, a vow unspoken but pulsing with each beat of his heart. He had not voiced it aloud yet, but he knew what he intended. Jaime Lannister, the Golden Son, was done with House Lannister. It was a path from which there was no return. Night began to fall, and he found a small grove of trees near a shallow stream to make camp. His horse drank from the stream while he gathered kindling. There was no lavish tent or squire to help him. He was alone, stripped to the bare essentials. With the help of his flint and steel, he sparked a small fire that cast dancing shadows among the trees. He sat there, listening to the sounds of chirping insects and rustling leaves, his body worn from riding and his mind heavy with questions. What would he do now? He could not simply wander the roads as some hedge knight. He was Jaime Lannister, trained by the finest masters at arms, possessed of skill and confidence few could match. He wore no cloak, but he retained his sword. That sword was his identity in many ways, more than any family crest. He considered riding north to see if he could speak with Robb Stark, though that notion sounded mad. The young wolf would surely have him executed for crimes against the Stark family. Perhaps that was what he deserved. But there was another thought, a faint glimmer of something like hope. He recalled the vow he had taken as a Kingsguard to protect the king, to protect the weak. That vow had been tainted by King Aerys's cruelty and by the Lannisters' ambitions. Yet might there be a chance to fulfill a truer version of that vow, away from the burdens of his father's plotting? Could he atone in some fashion for the wrongs he had allowed to happen? The night deepened, and stars glittered above, silent witnesses to his introspection. He tried to recall the last time he had slept beneath the open sky, free of courtiers and soldiers. It had likely been before he was knighted, in his youth when he traveled with Lord Sumner Crakehall's retinue. In those days, the world had seemed vast and brimming with possibility. Then, everything had narrowed into the gilded cage of the Kingsguard, and later, the suffocating intrigues of House Lannister's power. But here, beneath the stars, he felt that old sense of possibility stir again. He did not sleep well, haunted by dreams of Ned Stark's severed head bouncing along the rough wooden surface of the execution platform. In one dream, the head spoke, asking Jaime why he had not done the right thing. Jaime had no answer. He woke up, sweat-soaked, the fire reduced to embers. He stared at the ashes, feeling an echo of the same emptiness within himself. At dawn, he mounted his horse again and rode north along the King's Road, uncertain but resolute. Over the next few days, he encountered travelers, merchants hauling goods, small folk on foot, and the occasional group of soldiers. He kept his identity guarded, wearing plain clothing and letting the dust of the road cling to him. Yet he could not hide his fine mare or the sword at his hip, and more than a few curious eyes lingered on him. He caught snippets of conversation wherever he went. People whispered of war, whispers that grew louder the farther north he traveled. Robb Stark had marched south with a host, capturing key strongholds, inflicting defeats on the Lannisters that King's Landing tried to keep quiet. Lord Tywin was rumored to be mustering an even greater force. The Riverlands were aflame with conflict. Every tavern Jaime passed had some rumor of House Tully's resilience or House Frey's questionable loyalties. Each tale reminded him that he was caught in the middle of a war that had once seemed so straightforward. Lannisters against Starks, with the Iron Throne to be decided among them all. But now Jaime was a man without a house, or at least one who felt estranged from his own. He pressed on, unsure of what he sought, but guided by a resolve to break from the path that had led to Ned Stark's execution. As he rode, he could not help but reflect on Tyrion, his younger brother. Tyrion was likely still in King's Landing, or perhaps sent away as Hand of the King by Lord Tywin. Tyrion was clever and compassionate in ways Jaime admired. Yet he, too, was part of the Lannister puzzle, shaped by father's cruelty and society's mockery. Did Tyrion sense the same unease? Perhaps, but Tyrion was ever the survivor, playing the games of wit and deception to stay alive. Jaime could have sought out his brother before leaving, but he knew Tyrion would have tried to talk him out of it, or at least insisted on a plan. Jaime had none to give. He pushed forward. Days became a week, and he found himself nearing the Riverlands. He avoided main roads at times, skirting potential conflict, and lived off the land or bought simple meals from villagers. His once pristine attire became road-worn, but his sword remained ever sharp. Eventually, near a wooded crossroads, he encountered a group of armed men wearing the sigil of House Stark, a gray direwolf on a field of white. Instinctively, Jaime's hand moved to the hilt of his blade. There were 5 of them, each on horseback, scanning the forests as they went. They saw him at once, and their leader, a gruff-looking man with a black beard, signaled the others to surround Jaime. "Halt!" the bearded man barked. "State your name and business." Jaime's heart thudded in his chest. He considered lying, but would that help him now? He took a breath. "I am Jaime," he said at last, swallowing. "Jaime Lannister." There was a moment of stunned silence. 4 of the men reached for their weapons. The bearded man glared at Jaime, eyes narrowing. "A Lannister traveling alone? You must think us fools. Where's your escort, Kingslayer?" Jaime stiffened at the hated epithet, but he kept his voice steady. "I have no escort. I ride alone." One of the soldiers spat on the ground. "Like hell you do. You're a Lannister spy or some new trick from Tywin." Jaime could see fear and hatred in their faces. The North despised him, and with good reason. He was the man who ambushed Ned Stark in the streets of King's Landing, or so rumor claimed, the man who led Lannister forces that burned the Riverlands. And now Ned Stark was dead. Jaime inhaled slowly, his grip on the reins tightening. "I have renounced House Lannister," he said, forcing the words out. They felt unreal even as he spoke them. "I will not fight for my father or my sister's son. I ride alone, by choice." His words hung in the air. The soldiers exchanged glances of astonishment. The bearded man sneered. "Do you think we're green boys, to believe a tale like that?" Jaime shook his head. "I have not asked you to believe. I am merely telling you the truth. I do not serve the crown or the lion any longer." One of the men gave a humorless laugh. "And what do you expect us to do about that, Lannister? Are we to pat you on the back and bid you good travels? You're an enemy to House Stark, and we have orders to capture or kill any Lannister men we find." Jaime steadied himself, senses snapping to attention. He was outnumbered 5-1, though he knew in an all-out melee he could kill at least a few of them before they cut him down. Was that how his story would end, in a roadside skirmish? He wanted to say something more, to plead his case, but the men were shifting in their saddles, eyes gleaming with resentment. One man drew his sword slowly. Steel rasped against leather. "I have no quarrel with you," Jaime said quietly, though his own hand lingered on his hilt. "I come in peace." The bearded man's face twisted in a sneer. "There is no peace for Lannisters here. Surrender, and maybe you live to see a proper trial before the young wolf. Resist, and you die now." Jaime considered his options. If he surrendered, they might drag him in chains to Robb Stark's camp. Would Stark show mercy? It seemed unlikely. Perhaps there was a chance. Robb was young, rumored to be honorable in his own northern way. But the thirst for vengeance was real, especially after Ned Stark's execution. Jaime exhaled. "Very well," he said, lifting his hands away from his sword. "I will surrender to Robb Stark, but I am no prisoner of war in the sense you think. I come to seek audience with him." His words baffled them. 2 men snorted and pressed closer, swords drawn. The bearded leader gestured sharply, and one soldier dismounted, approaching Jaime. The man yanked Jaime's sword from its sheath and then unceremoniously tugged his hands behind his back. Ropes bit into Jaime's wrists, cutting off circulation. The soldier patted Jaime down, finding no hidden daggers. All the while, Jaime kept his gaze level, ignoring the flicker of humiliation in his chest. This was the price of the path he chose. They bound him securely, tied him to his own horse by the waist, and led him through the winding roads. Jaime swallowed any protest. He told himself that if he truly believed in this course, then he must see it through. And so he rode with the men of the north, aware that any slight misstep would earn him a blade to the ribs. 2 days of travel under guard brought them deeper into the riverlands, where the scars of war were obvious. Fields lay burned, villages emptied or destroyed. The men treated him with open hostility, though they stopped short of actual violence. Jaime overheard them muttering about the atrocities committed by Lannister forces. The sacking of local towns, rapes, murders. Jaime felt a gnawing sense of guilt, even though he had not personally ordered such acts. His father's men had done so with the Lannister banner flapping overhead, and that was enough for the small folk to hate him as if he had swung the torches himself. The journey concluded at the outskirts of a sizable war camp. Banners of the dire wolf fluttered in the breeze, and thousands of tents stretched across the plains. The air was thick with the scent of horses, sweat, and cook fires. Soldiers dressed in leather and mail trudged to and fro, pausing to stare at Jaime as he was led past. Word spread quickly. A Lannister had been captured. Perhaps the Lannister. They brought him to a large pavilion marked by a taller banner. Guards at the entry parted to let them pass, but their gazes lingered on Jaime with suspicion. The bearded leader led Jaime inside, where the flicker of lantern light revealed a makeshift command chamber. Maps of the Riverlands were pinned to a wooden table. Robb Stark stood there, a lean young man with auburn curls and an expression of grave maturity that belied his years. Grey Wind, his direwolf, sat at his side, ears alert. Robb looked up, surprise crossing his features when he recognized the prisoner before him. He stood straighter, hand reflexively going to touch his sword hilt. Behind him, a tall knight with a fish sigil on his surcoat, clearly a Tully, narrowed his eyes. Another figure, a grizzled man with a weather-beaten face, studied Jaime closely. Cat's eyes, Jaime thought, though it was not Catelyn Stark. This must be some trusted retainer. The bearded man gave a stiff bow. "My lord, we found him on the road. Says he rides alone, that he's renounced House Lannister. Tried to claim he wants an audience with you." Robb Stark's brow furrowed. He regarded Jaime with cold disdain. "You must think us gullible, Kingslayer, if you expect us to believe such a story." Jaime met Robb's gaze steadily. The memory of how he had once bested the Stark guards in King's Landing nagged at him, and he imagined that day had never left Robb's mind. "I don't ask you to be gullible," Jaime said, voice level. "Only to listen." Grey Wind let out a low growl, baring sharp teeth. Jaime forced himself to keep his composure, though a part of him trembled. Direwolves were fearsome beasts. Robb placed a hand on Grey Wind's fur to calm him. "You have one chance to speak, Lannister. If I don't like what I hear, I'll have you thrown in a cell or worse." Jaime swallowed. "Very well. I left King's Landing because I could not abide what was done to Lord Eddard Stark. Perhaps you think that's a lie or that I somehow participated in his death. I did not. My sister and my son, Joffrey, saw to that. I am tired of the cruelty and the endless pursuit of power at the cost of honor." He paused, shifting to ease the rope binding him. "I know my hands are not clean. I have killed men, some in open battle, some under questionable circumstances. But I wish to break free of it. I know that your father was a good man, and he died unjustly. If you wish my head for what House Lannister has done, I will not resist. But I ask that you hear me out. I renounce the claim of House Lannister on me. I am no longer their sworn sword." The tent was silent save for the crackle of lanterns and Grey Wind's steady breathing. Robb studied Jaime as if trying to see into his soul. The Tully Knight muttered something under his breath, looking ready to protest. The older man with the watchful eyes frowned, clearly uncertain. Robb finally spoke. "Why now? You've served the Lannister cause for years, even before you were part of the Kingsguard. You attacked my father in the streets of King's Landing, or at least your men did under your command. And now, when Ned Stark is dead, you turn your cloak." Jaime's mouth felt dry. "Because I saw what Joffrey truly is, and what my father truly is." Tyrion aside, "My family is rotted from within by ambition and cruelty. Killing Ned Stark was the final straw. I suppose I had illusions that we would trade him for your sisters, or at least hold him as leverage. But Joffrey had to prove his might and demanded the execution. The realm will bleed for it, and I don't wish to be part of that anymore." Robb's expression hardened at the mention of his sisters. "Sansa is captive in the Red Keep. Arya is missing. Joffrey holds my sister's life in his hands, and he took my father's. Do you think I can simply welcome you to my camp with open arms?" "No, I do not," Jaime said. "If I were in your position, I'd want me dead as well. But I ask that you consider if there's any use for me alive." It was a calculated risk. Jaime knew the value of a highborn captive, especially one so close to the Lannister patriarch. He was essentially offering himself as a potential bargaining chip, though he detested the idea. Still, it might keep him alive long enough to do something worthwhile. The older man stepped forward. "My lord, we should put him in chains until we can verify any part of his story," he said to Robb. "He's dangerous." Robb nodded, eyes never leaving Jaime. "I agree, Lord Bolton." Then he addressed Jaime directly. "You'll be taken to a secure place where you will remain under guard. If we find any sign that you're lying or attempting to sabotage us, you'll be executed. Is that clear?" Jaime inclined his head. "Perfectly clear." With a curt gesture, Robb signaled for the soldiers to remove Jaime from the pavilion. As they seized him by the ropes and escorted him out, Jaime caught a glimpse of Grey Wind's eyes, golden and piercing. The beast stared after him with a predatory calm, as if memorizing his scent. Jaime suppressed a shudder and allowed himself to be led away. They brought him to a stout wooden cage on the edge of the camp, a makeshift cell used for prisoners of war. Several other men were locked up as well, mostly Lannister soldiers captured in battle. They glared in confusion when Jaime was shoved in with them. Immediately, one recognized him and spat. "Kingslayer? What the hell?" Jaime said nothing as the door slammed shut. He noticed the others shift, some suspicious, others uncertain. They muttered among themselves. Jaime settled near the corner of the cage, his arms still bound, and let his head rest against the rough wooden bars. He wondered if he had merely exchanged one form of captivity for another. For the moment, he had to cling to the hope that something good might come of this choice, that by removing himself from his father's clutches, he could reduce one more sword from the Lannister side of this war. If it saved even a few lives, maybe it was worth it. Days passed in that cage, days of stale bread, sour ale, and jests from northern guards who seemed to relish mocking a Lannister. Jaime bore it with as much dignity as he could, though the humiliation festered. He was a knight, once a Kingsguard, regarded as one of the finest swordsmen in the realm. Yet here he was, caged like an animal among common soldiers who had cursed his name when they knelt to piss. He tried to keep his mind off the indignity by focusing on small tasks, like braiding bits of straw or listening to the talk of guards. From time to time, they mentioned developments in the war, the movements of Tywin Lannister's forces, and the ongoing battles. Occasionally, the Tully Knight, Ser Edmure, or so Jaime overheard, passed by, giving him a stern look but saying nothing. The older man, Lord Roose Bolton, came by once to study Jaime with cool, calculating eyes. Bolton seemed like a man with secrets in his heart, but Jaime did not trust his expression enough to glean anything. None of them engaged Jaime in conversation about his alleged renunciation. Perhaps they were waiting for Robb Stark to decide his fate. At last, on a crisp morning, a guard opened the cage door and motioned for Jaime to come out. "Lord Stark wants you. No trouble or we cut you down," said the guard. Jaime stepped forward, stiff from days of confinement, wrists still bound. 2 guards flanked him. He squared his shoulders, reminding himself that if he had chosen this path, he had to follow it, no matter where it led. They brought him to a different area of the camp, where Robb Stark, Lord Bolton, and a few other northern lords sat around a table with maps. The smell of stew and ale hung in the air. Soldiers moved about, some bearing messages, others off to spar or tend horses. Stark's eyes flicked to Jaime, neither warm nor overly hostile. Precarious neutrality. "What do you want of me?" Jaime asked, keeping his voice measured. Robb set down a quill. "We have considered your claim that you've renounced House Lannister. Whether that is true or not, you're still a valuable piece to us as a captive. The question is how best to use you." Jaime waited, heart pounding. Lord Bolton broke in smoothly. "The Karstarks would have your head for what happened to Lord Eddard, but our king has ordered them to stay their blades until he decides. We have no illusions, Lannister, that you are suddenly a friend. However, King Robb has wondered if your knowledge of King's Landing and its defenses might be useful. You served on the Kingsguard, after all." Jaime felt a flicker of relief that they were at least speaking, but also caution. "I have no wish to see the city sacked, if that's what you imply. There are thousands of innocent people there." Robb gave a short laugh, though it was humorless. "Perhaps you should have thought of that before your sister's son executed my father. Still, I did not bring you here to debate innocence. War is upon us. I want to retake my sisters and ensure the security of the North. If that means breaching the city walls, so be it." Jaime swallowed. "I can offer knowledge of the city, yes. Its walls, the secret passages I know of. But if it comes to a battle, I cannot fight for you in a siege of King's Landing. I renounced my family, not my conscience. A siege will mean suffering for the small folk." A murmur of disapproval rippled among the northern lords. One with a fierce-looking face barked, "He has the gall to speak of conscience now?" Robb raised a hand to silence him. "War brings suffering, Jaime Lannister. I'd rather avoid a full-scale siege if possible, but Joffrey has my sister. If I can gain the city another way, through cunning or infiltration, I will do it. If you can help, maybe I'll show you some measure of mercy. If not, you remain a prisoner." Jaime measured Robb's tone. The boy was no fool. He was young, but he carried a sharp presence that reminded Jaime more of Ned Stark than the naive child many assumed. "Very well," Jaime said at length. "I will advise you as best I can, but I have no authority to trade your sister for any ransom. That remains with the Queen Regent." Bolton spoke again, his voice silky. "We have considered that. It is possible that, should you pen a letter to your sister and nephew, urging them to release Sansa Stark, we might find some arrangement. A trade, perhaps." Jaime grimaced. "That letter would mean little. Cersei knows me too well. She would suspect manipulation, or she might ignore it entirely if it suits her. Still, I can write it. I just doubt it will bear fruit." Robb nodded slowly. "Write it anyway. Perhaps it will help. For now, you will remain under guard, but I'll allow you slightly better conditions than the cage. A tent if you behave. You will report to me and my council when summoned. If I hear any hint of treachery, you die." Jaime let out a quiet breath. "Understood." He was given parchment and ink, and escorted to a small tent surrounded by guards. He was unbound only under strict watch so he could write. At first, he stared at the blank parchment, mind awash with the enormity of what he was doing. He was writing to Cersei, effectively on behalf of Robb Stark. What could he say that would truly move her? He recalled her ambitions, her cold cunning, her deep love for her children. Perhaps that was the key, Cersei's sense of motherhood, twisted though it might be. Jaime dipped the quill into the ink and began. "Cersei, you will wonder at this letter, for I write from the camp of Robb Stark, your enemy. I have renounced my claim to House Lannister, for reasons that no doubt baffle you. Yet, I ask that you set aside your immediate outrage and consider that there is an opportunity here. A chance to spare more bloodshed, to spare Joffrey from the stain of tyranny. Stark demands the return of his sister, Sansa. In exchange, he is willing to consider leniency for those who hold her. Think of Joffrey's reign. Do you want it defined by the suffering and death of a young girl? Ned Stark's death was already a blow to the stability of the realm. Another such act might plunge King's Landing further into chaos. I do not write this as your enemy, but as one who cares for the realm and once cared for you. Release Sansa Stark, or at least negotiate her freedom. It may avert a greater calamity. He paused, uncertain if he should add anything more personal. Would it make a difference? Finally, he set the quill down. It was enough. She would recognize his hand and read his tone. Whether she heeded him was another matter. He presented the letter to one of the guards, who took it to Robb's council. For weeks thereafter, Jaime remained in that tent, guarded and watched. Occasionally, he was permitted to walk under escort around the camp perimeter. He observed the northern soldiers training, listened to them telling stories of home. These were men and boys who had never expected to leave the north, now hardened by the rigors of war. Jaime couldn't help but admire their devotion. They fought not for gold, but for the memory of their lord and the safety of their families. He also noticed tensions within the camp. Certain lords questioned Robb's leadership decisions, others doubted the presence of a Lannister in their midst, even as a prisoner. Jaime caught fragments of talk suggesting that Lord Bolton was more cunning than he let on, that he had his own designs. Still, Robb held the loyalty of most with his victories and a natural charisma that commanded respect. Then, one day, everything changed. A raven arrived from King's Landing. Jaime didn't see the contents, but he saw the effect. Robb Stark emerged from his pavilion, lips thin, a letter clutched in his hand. He summoned Jaime, and the guards marched him before the boy king of the north once more. Robb's face was grave. "My mother has returned with news from the south," Robb said, gesturing for Jaime to stand before the map table. "She visited Renly Baratheon's camp, seeking allies. But Renly is dead now, and Stannis marches on King's Landing. The city is in danger of falling." He paused, scanning Jaime's face. "Cersei's letter arrived as well, though not by the same raven. She refuses to give up Sansa. She claims you are a traitor to your house and an enemy of the throne." Jaime swallowed, though he expected little else from Cersei. "Then any negotiation is moot." Robb nodded. "We also received word that the city's defenses are being reinforced by Tyrion's orders. Wildfire, massive chains in Blackwater Bay. My mother heard rumors. It seems they're preparing for Stannis' assault. If the city falls to Stannis, Sansa's fate remains uncertain." Bolton's voice, soft and cold, interjected. "We could attempt to reach the city before Stannis, but that would be a fool's charge. And if Tywin's army engages us..." Robb cut him off. "I know. It's a dilemma. I want to rescue my sister. But if Cersei refuses any parley, my only recourse is to fight through whatever stands in my path, which could be Tywin, could be Stannis, or both. That means countless northern lives spent on this cause." Jaime felt a pang of empathy. He remembered Sansa as a sweet, naive girl, infatuated with the idea of knights and princes. She had done no harm to anyone. She deserved better than to be a pawn in this war. "I know the city," Jaime offered quietly. "If there is a way to smuggle her out." Robb eyed him. "You propose infiltration? A stealth mission to free my sister under the Lannisters and Stannis' noses? You'd be recognized in a heartbeat." Jaime nodded, acknowledging the risk. "Perhaps. But I also know passages that few do, ones built by Maegor the Cruel, rumored to be used by Varys the Spider. If you sent a small team, perhaps men who can pass unnoticed, they might find her and spirit her out of the city before the siege or sack begins." The northern lords exchanged doubtful looks. One scoffed. "He'd lead them to a trap. I wouldn't trust him not to raise the alarm." Jaime sighed. "I'm well aware no one here trusts me, but I am offering the best path to spare your sister from the horror of a siege. I have no desire to see the city sacked or more innocents slaughtered." Robb stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of Jaime's words. Grey Wind, ever vigilant, stood at Robb's side, tail swishing. The boy king gave a slight nod. "We'll consider this option. But if we do it, you will remain our prisoner, and I'll have a small group of men glean everything they can from you about those passages. If they succeed, your life is spared. If they fail, we have no further use for you." Jaime accepted those terms. There was nothing else he could do. Thus began a tense period of planning. Robb selected a handful of his best scouts and a few men more accustomed to blending in than standing out in shining armor. Jaime was brought in daily to answer questions about the secret ways of the Red Keep, the hidden doors rumored to exist in the dungeons, the labyrinthine tunnels under the hill of Aegon's High Hill. Some of it was guesswork, gleaned from stories he had heard in the Kingsguard, while other details were based on glimpses he'd had himself. The men took notes, asked clarifying questions, and then left Jaime under guard. He could sense their skepticism, their belief that he might be feeding them half-truths. But he remained as honest as he could. If a stealth mission could save Sansa from the horrors that were surely coming, he felt an odd sense of responsibility to see it succeed. Perhaps it was the last shreds of honor that lingered within him, or a desire to atone for House Lannister's crimes. Whatever the reason, he cooperated fully. Meanwhile, ravens came and went. The war raged on. Tywin Lannister's forces clashed with Northern Bannermen in the Riverlands. Stannis pressed closer to King's Landing. Rumors suggested that Renly's loyalists had scattered, and that the Tyrells were uncertain whom to support. Robb Stark had his own challenges, balancing the demands of the River Lords, containing the ambitions of men like Roose Bolton, and trying to maintain alliances. Jaime glimpsed the weight on Robb's shoulders each time the youth consulted with his advisors, each time another letter arrived bearing grim news of casualties. One evening, as Jaime sat alone in his tent, a shadow fell across the entrance. The flap opened, revealing Catelyn Stark. She wore a cloak of gray wool, her auburn hair streaked with lines of silver at the temples. Grief and resolve etched her face. 2 guards hovered at her back. Jaime stood, uncertain, bowing his head slightly. "Lady Stark," he murmured. She dismissed the guards with a gesture, stepping inside. "Leave us," she said, her tone brooking no argument. Once they were alone, she met Jaime's eyes. He could see sorrow there, but also a fierce anger that glinted like steel. "You claim to have renounced House Lannister. Why should I believe it?" Jaime swallowed. He had expected this confrontation. "You have little reason to believe, my lady. I can only tell you that I had nothing to do with Ned Stark's death, and I came here in hopes of doing something, anything, to stop the bloodshed from growing worse." Her lip curled in a bitter half-smile. "My daughters remain lost, my husband's bones unburied, and the one who could have saved him stood by. You have the nerve to speak of bloodshed." He inclined his head. Her anger was justified. "I stood by, yes," he admitted, "and I came to hate myself for it. That's why I left." She let out a shaky breath, as though trying to contain an onslaught of emotions. "Do you know where Arya is? Or what became of her?" Jaime shook his head. "I heard rumors she fled the city. That's all. She wasn't seen by the guards, at least not that I know of." Catelyn looked away, as if to hide the tears that threatened. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice tight. "And Sansa?" Jaime hesitated. "Likely she's still a hostage in the Red Keep, forced to endure Joffrey's cruelty. I wish I could tell you she was safe. But with the war about to reach King's Landing, no one is safe." Her jaw clenched. "If your infiltration plan helps us rescue her, I will be grateful. But do not think it will erase the memory of what you did to my husband in the streets of King's Landing." He did not try to argue or defend himself. He knew the stories. She believed he had attacked Ned. The truth was that Ned and his men had clashed with Jaime's men, and blood was spilled. Jaime left Ned alive that day, but the consequences were still dire. There was no excusing it. "I know," he said softly. "I do not expect forgiveness, my lady." She studied him a moment longer, then turned to leave. At the tent flap, she paused. "If Sansa is harmed before we can save her, I promise you, Jaime Lannister, I will see you pay for it, no matter what you claim to renounce." Then she was gone, leaving Jaime to stare into the dim candlelight, her words echoing in his mind. The infiltration plan took shape swiftly. A small group of men, led by a wary scout named Gareth, were given detailed instructions by Jaime regarding potential secret entrances. At night, they slipped away from the camp, hoping to traverse the war-torn roads undetected and reach King's Landing before Stannis' final assault. Jaime waited, day after day, for news of their success or failure. The tension in the northern camp was palpable. Some men seemed eager to march south to join the fray. Others wanted to remain in the Riverlands, keep pressure on Tywin's forces, or even return to defend the north. Robb weighed each counsel carefully, uncertain how to proceed without a clear sign from his infiltration team. Finally, a messenger returned in the dead of night, ragged and exhausted. Jaime heard shouts outside his tent and saw lanterns spring to life across the camp. He stepped out, flanked by guards, as the messenger was led into Robb's pavilion. Minutes later, Jaime was summoned. Inside the pavilion, Robb stood near a table where the messenger, a gaunt man with a fresh wound on his arm, clutched a damp piece of parchment. Gray wind prowled near the flap, snarling softly at any sudden movement. Lady Catelyn and several northern lords crowded around, their expressions grim. Robb gestured Jaime forward. "They reached the city," Robb said, his voice subdued, but Stannis moved faster than expected. His fleet attacked the Blackwater, and Tyrion Lannister unleashed wildfire. The river burned green. Thousands died. But the Tyrells arrived at the last moment, siding with the Lannisters. Stannis was defeated, and he retreated. The infiltration team tried to find Sansa in the chaos. They succeeded in making contact with one of the Red Keep servants, apparently a girl named Shay. She confirmed Sansa is still alive, but heavily guarded. The men attempted to extract her through the dungeons. Jaime's heart pounded, and the messenger lifted his gaze to Jaime. They were discovered. Some were killed. Gareth was captured. Only I escaped with news of their failure. The girl, Sansa, remains a prisoner. The servant told them that Lord Tywin and the Tyrells swept into the city after Stannis' defeat, and the Lannisters now hold firm control of King's Landing. No chance of freeing her without an army. A heavy silence descended. Jaime felt a twist of despair. He had truly hoped the infiltration would succeed, that Sansa might be spared the agony of being Joffrey's hostage. But the combined forces of House Tyrell and House Lannister had saved the city from Stannis, ensuring Cersei's power remained. House Lannister would only tighten its grip on Sansa now. Robb lowered his head, knuckles whitening on the table's edge. "Then we have no option but to continue the war," he said quietly. "I must gather allies, find a way to break the Lannisters' power, and force them to release my sister. The infiltration plan is no longer viable." Lord Bolton nodded, his pale eyes flicking toward Jaime. "And what of him? He no longer has any strategic value, and the infiltration failed. We might use him as a bargaining chip, but Tywin has never shown any inclination to trade for you, Kingslayer." His lip curled in a small, unpleasant smile. Robb raised his hand. "For now, he remains our prisoner. We will decide his fate in due time." His gaze slid to Jaime. "If you truly renounced your house, you are as alone as you've ever been." Catelyn Stark stood with an expression of quiet rage, tears glistening in her eyes. The infiltration had been their best hope to save Sansa without another battle. Now that hope lay in ruins. She stepped away from the group, leaving the pavilion as though she couldn't bear to look at Jaime a moment longer. Jaime was ushered back to his tent, despair coiling in his gut. He had abandoned House Lannister only to find himself powerless to right the wrongs done to the Starks. The war churned on, unstoppable, a monster devouring lives on both sides. He thought of Tyrion, who must have orchestrated the wildfire plan. Tyrion had saved the city from Stannis, for which the Lannisters would hail him as a hero. Meanwhile, Jaime stood on the other side of the conflict, caged in all but name. Several more weeks passed. Ravens carried news of the war's progress. Stannis regrouped on Dragonstone, licking his wounds. The Tyrell alliance had cemented Lannister control of King's Landing, with Margaery Tyrell rumored to be betrothed to King Joffrey. In the Riverlands, Tywin's forces and Robb Stark's army circled each other, with skirmishes here and there, but no decisive battle. Tension simmered. Jaime felt like a man in limbo, neither friend nor foe, merely a token. During this time, he had conversations with some of the northern soldiers who guarded him. A few were curious about his decision to forsake House Lannister. Others simply wanted to gloat about the famed Kingslayer being brought low. But occasionally, he found a man or two who would talk of simpler things, fishing in the White Knife or hunting in the Wolfswood. Jaime listened, a strange warmth stirring in him. He had spent so long among courtiers and schemers that hearing honest talk of normal life felt alien and refreshing. In quiet moments, he wondered what the future held for him. Perhaps Robb Stark would keep him as a hostage indefinitely. Or perhaps House Lannister would eventually be forced to negotiate. If Tywin fell, if the city burned, if the North triumphed, none of it seemed certain. Jaime was a man adrift, shackled by his own complicated past. Then came the day Robb called him forth again, this time with a smaller retinue. They gathered in the quiet of the morning, near the bank of a narrow river that flowed by the camp. The sun glinted on the water, and the sky was a pale blue. Robb stood with Lady Catelyn at his side, Grey Wind at his heels. Lord Bolton and a few bannermen lingered behind. It felt oddly intimate, as if they wanted no large audience for what was to come. Robb eyed Jaime, who stood under guard, hands unbound but still closely watched. "You said once that if we spared your life, you'd do what you could to help bring peace," Robb began, voice measured. "Your infiltration plan failed, but I have a new proposal." Jaime waited, heart pounding. The phrase at the twins have grown restless. "I need their crossing to move my army effectively. They demand concessions. My grandfather, Lord Hoster Tully, is ill, and the Riverlands are fractious. My mother advises me to seek alliances, perhaps even with the Lannisters, if it would free Sansa." He paused, meeting Jaime's gaze. "You are proof that a Lannister can be parted from his house. But if you truly want to end this war, perhaps you can be the key to a negotiation. Or, if you cannot, we have no further use for you." Catelyn's gaze burned into Jaime, as if searching for any sign of betrayal. Jaime exhaled. "I will try, but do not expect an easy road. Tywin wants power above all. He will not relent unless forced." Robb nodded. "I know, but so do I in my own way. I want my sister safe, and I want the North free from Lannister rule. If we can reach some accord," Lord Bolton interrupted, voice smooth. "And what if your father spurns all attempts at peace? Will you finally put this man to death, my lord?" A grim silence settled. Robb regarded Jaime with a certain weariness, like a man who had seen too many battlefields for his young years. "If there is no peace to be made, I may not have a choice." Then he looked out over the water, as if imagining a time beyond the bloodshed. "But I will explore every possibility first." So it was decided. They would send Jaime as an envoy, under guard, perhaps with Lady Catelyn or another trusted party, to seek a parley with Tywin or Tyrion. Jaime's knowledge of the family might persuade them that he spoke truthfully, that a settlement could be reached to exchange Sansa for certain guarantees. Or it might all be in vain. But it was a chance, however slim, to save lives and end the war. That evening, alone in his tent, Jaime considered the precarious path ahead. He had never imagined he would one day stand in open opposition to Tywin Lannister, or that he might negotiate on behalf of the Starks. Yet here he was, set on a course that might redefine his entire identity, or lead him to a nameless grave. He thought of Cersei, of the illusions he once cherished of love and power. He closed his eyes, letting the night's chill seep through the canvas walls, and felt a mixture of dread and quiet determination. A sliver of hope dwelled in him, small but persistent. Perhaps, if he could find the right words, if Tyrion was open to reason, or if Tywin saw advantage in a truce, something could shift. The realm was broken, battered by war, and countless innocents had suffered. If Jaime could help in any way to halt the spiral of violence, then maybe this renunciation was not in vain. Maybe, in forsaking the Golden Lion, he had found a faint path toward redemption. He listened to the sounds of the northern camp settling in for the night, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of men around the fires, the occasional bark of a dog. Over all of it, the wind sighed through the trees, whispering of roads yet traveled. Jaime lay back on his cot, restless. Tomorrow he would begin a new journey, one he had never foreseen. Jaime Lannister, neither lion nor kingslayer, but simply a man trying to do one decent thing in a world gone mad. And so he waited for dawn, heart in turmoil, yet oddly resolved. Dawn would bring fresh light to the land, illuminating the faces of friends and enemies alike. Jaime could only hope that, in that new day's glow, he might forge a different path than the one that had led him here. Perhaps redemption was a fool's dream, but for the first time in his life, Jaime Lannister dared to dream it anyway.